So it's probably hard to make speech about mass prosperity without talking about Trump, but I will leave that for the end because, there's a disease which historians warn us about. It's called presentism. Presentism is a belief that today's circumstances are so special and so unique and nobody has ever faced them before. So if we leave presentism aside, it's obviously a tough time for India, but was it tougher in the 1950s when the Communist Party had declared war on the Indian state? Was it tougher in the 1960s when we'd run out of food? Was it tougher in the 1970s when we had emergency? Was it tougher in the 1980s when we had Blue Star and I was born and brought up in Kashmir? Or was it tougher in the 90s when we ran out of foreign exchange? It's unclear, so it's always important to sort of step back and think about what we're trying to do. But mass democracy and mass prosperity are connected in most theoretical worlds. There is no mass, there is no democracy. There is nobody with a per capita income of more than $40,000, which is not a democracy. So India was two reckless experiments in 1947. One was giving a vote to everybody. No country had done that before us. Most countries gave it to the rich, the landed, the educated. Some women in Switzerland got to vote in 1972. But we did that, so 3 million people in India win an election, 22 million people stand for an election, so we did create mass democracy. But why didn't we create mass prosperity? And to me, there was another reckless experiment. It was called the 1955 Avadi Resolution. It was really codified in the 1956 Second Five-Year Plan, where we sort of concluded that the private sector would be handicapped, capital markets would be handicapped, banks would be nationalized. There were 482 interest rates prescribed by RBI for different kinds of lending as recently as 1974. So we didn't do mass prosperity. What did we learn from this lack of mass prosperity? I think we learned 4 or 5 things. One is there's no such thing as poor people. There are people in poor places. Right? An electrician who moves from Balasore in Orissa to Lucknow in UP gets 2 times more salary, moves to Bangalore, gets 4 times more salary, moves to Dubai, gets 8 times more salary, and moves to Switzerland and gets 25 times more salary. It's the same damn electrician. I'm not talking about skill development and soft skills and hard skills. You just pick up the same electrician and move them from place to place. So it's really which country you're born in is obvious, right? But in India, which state you're born in, right? My parents live in UP, I live in Karnataka. Both states have the same GDP, but Karnataka does it with 1/5 the number of people. Which city you're born in or live in? I live in Bangalore. If everybody in India lived in Bangalore, then India's GDP would be more than China, right? India's GDP is $2,500. Bangalore's GDP is $11,000. Which sector you work in, right? We all do puja of IT, and IT and software has been wonderful rebranding for India, but IT is 0.8% of the labor force. But we respect it because it's 8% of GDP. While agriculture is 42% of the labor force and it's only 12% of GDP. So the productivity of your sector is really even above the company, which is the next place, right? Firms. There's a 25 times difference in productivity between our biggest and our smallest firms. So you don't pay the wage premium, then you're not productive. But if you're not productive, you can't pay the wage premium, right? So why is India's enterprise stack? We have 63 million enterprises. 12 million of them don't have an office. 12 million work from home. Only 15 million are registered for GST. Only 1 million pay Provident Fund or ESI. But there are only 29,500 companies in India with a paid-up capital of more than $1.5 million. So how does 6.3 crore enterprises only translate to 29,500 companies with a paid-up capital of more than 10 crores? And that's what explains the difference in productivity between firms, right? And then obviously with skills you have. We pay 4 times different salary to a kid the same age, with the same qualification on paper, willing to do the same job based on soft skills, based on body odor, based on shaving, based on tucking your shirt in. And this is nothing personal. People are inventory for me. So we think about at the same kid with a BCom may get 15,000 rupees with one employer and may get 45,000 rupees with the other employer. So I think the notion of no such thing as poor people but poor places forces you to recognize that the pathology is not at the level of the individual and it's really at the level of the system. Another pathology which we have learned is we don't have a shortage of land labor capital. You could give every Indian household half an acre and they would fit into Rajasthan and Maharashtra. We don't have a shortage of labor. 40% of our labor force is Vela. We don't have a shortage of capital when we deserve it, right? 50% of India's foreign direct investment since 1947 has come in the last 7 years. 90% of India's private equity and venture capital investment has come in the last 12 years. So there's no shortage of land labor capital. So what's the problem? The problem is how it combines. This is what economists call total factor productivity. Most of you can call it innovation, you can call it entrepreneurship, you can call it technology. But how does land labor capital combine to produce a firm which is a baby, not a dwarf, because all companies are small, but babies are small and grow, and dwarfs are small that will stay small, in a sector that is productive enough to pay the wages, right? And so that leads us to the obvious thing that GDP, total GDP doesn't matter as GDP per capita. We may be fifth in GDP, total GDP. We'll soon be third in total GDP, but we're 128th in per capita GDP. And so the only thing linked to total GDP is military spending. Everything else that matters to our lives for firms and individuals is linked to per capita GDP. And I think mass prosperity is really linked. You can say median household income if you don't agree with per capita GDP, because if you throw Mukesh Ambani and Nandan and a few other people into the Indian Ocean, our inequality will come down. But I don't think the poor will care. This Gini coefficient notion of inequality before prosperity may be an unfair sort of thing, because even if you threw the top 10 billionaires in India into the Indian Ocean, the Gini coefficient would improve by 40%, but I don't think that would make a difference to the poor. So if we step back and say, what do we do for mass prosperity, or how do we define mass prosperity? I think that's really a question. Sometimes I get a pushback on my definition of mass prosperity, right? And so what is strength? My favorite Hindi poet is Ramdhari Singh Dinkar. He says, Shama shobhati us bhujang ko jiske paas garal ho. Right? Only the powerful can be kind, benevolent, and generous. The weak can't be kind, benevolent, and generous. And if India wants to be powerful, how do we define power? Is it the hard power of 10 mountain brigades or 4 Rafale squadrons or 2 more sort of aircraft carriers? Of course. As somebody born and brought up in Kashmir, the last year has been a reminder of the importance of hard power. But is it soft power? Movies, music, novels, and stuff like that? Soft power has had a very bad few years, if not a bad decade. Soft power doesn't matter as much as we thought it did 10 years ago. We all talked about soft power, but obviously it's had a bad decade. But in my mind, obviously both hard power and soft power are symbolic of something else. They are symbolic of teamwork between the private sector, government, and the non-profits, right? The private sector has a trust deficit, the government has an execution deficit, and non-profits have a scale deficit. So partly our challenge has been everybody in the government looks down on everybody in the private sector as money grubbing, profiteering. We look down on everybody in the government as corrupt, and non-profits look down on everybody. So the challenge for us is how to get over our high horses and sort of think about teamwork. And in my case, I would say that it's really it's deepening human capital, it's decentralizing power, and it would be deregulating our economy. So deepening human capital is just obvious. I think everything is downstream. The only renewable energy in a country is human capital. Your schools, your colleges, your universities, your think tanks, your books, whatever else, right? As my best friend whom I never met, the Buddha, used to say, Atmadipo Bhav, be your own light. And we have outsourced our universities for too long to the US. Places like Ashoka are now making a difference. But we have to remind ourselves that college isn't what it used to be. The world has produced more graduates in the last 40 years than 800 years before that. So what does that mean? 60% of taxi drivers in Korea now have a college degree. 31% of Walmart checkout clerks now have a college degree. 15% of high-end security guards have a college degree. So college is really getting reimagined. Obviously, skill development for us has been a challenge. And the school system has been a challenge. The most embarrassing number about India is that only 45% of our kids are left in government schools. This is not an argument against private schools. I went to one and so did my kids. But if anything should be free and add quality in a society, it's got to be private schools. So deepening human capital, which is, and let's not separate education and employability, because there's really, that boundary is really blurring. Let's not distinguish too much between repair, prepare, and upgrade, because that's a continuum when you think about skill development. So we need learning while learning, we need learning by doing, we need learning with qualification modularity, we need learning with multimodal delivery, and we need learning with signaling value, right? My wife went to Harvard. That's a good place to be at, but it's a better place to be from. The fundamental value of going to IIT or Harvard is being from there, not at there, is my view. Everybody thinks my wife is smarter than she is for the rest of her life, right? But that's important because the Nobel Prize in Economics went to Peter Diamond for his work on the signaling value of education. So deepening human capital has to move beyond credentialing, and to recognize that maybe the 12 years of school are actually more valuable than the 3 months of skill development. The other one is decentralize, and I think this is really, really important. Indira Gandhi in 15 of her speeches said strong states lead to a weak nation. NTR responded the next day, he was chief minister, and he said, well, everything that matters to the daily lives of citizens is done by chief ministers and by state governments. Actually, I would go a step further. 29 chief ministers clearly matter more than one prime minister. No doubt about it for mass prosperity. But 100 mayors matter more than 29 chief ministers, and we don't have mayors. And in 1924, Jawaharlal Nehru was the mayor of Allahabad, Vallabhbhai Patel was the mayor of Ahmedabad, Chittaranjan Das was the mayor of Calcutta, and Rajendra Prasad was the mayor of Patna. And I have 4 letters from Vallabhbhai Patel talking about school teacher absenteeism. I have 3 letters from Jawaharlal Nehru talking about street lights in Allahabad. That would never happen because power is so far from where it is. So I think decentralization is, what is power in government? Government is, it's funds, functions, and functionaries, I have learned. You track the funds, you track the functionaries, and you track the functions. And in the US and China, 50% of government spending and government employment is now at the 3rd tier of government. In India, only 3% of spending is at 3rd tier of government and only 15% of employment. So I think if we want to give more funds, functions, and functionaries, which is the only form of power in government, we have to hand that over to the 3rd tier. The last one would be deregulation. My view is when people want to go faster, they usually jam the accelerator. It's better to take your foot off the brake, right? There are 67,000 compliances. There are 26,000 ways for an employer to go to jail in India. There are 6,700 filings. This is now a public database, which we took 4 years to put together, because every time I would rave and rant about regulatory cholesterol, everybody in the government would say, can you make that more specific? I said, but you wrote the laws, you have the acts, you have the laws. But anyway, we spent 4 years and now we have a database of the 26,000 ways that an employer can go to jail. And I think this deregulation is much more important than fiscal and monetary policy. The economists have really made our life miserable by overselling fiscal and monetary policy. Government spending has gone up 108 times since 1990. Per capita income has only gone up 8 times. Government spending in 1990 was 82,000 crores. It's now 110 lakh crores. And monetary policy is really not a solution to productivity. After 5 years on the RBI board, I haven't decided whether monetary policy is a placebo or a painkiller or a steroid. It's definitely not a medicine. So let's not oversell fiscal and monetary policy and go straight from the bird's eye view of employers' daily life to the camel's eye view, or more importantly, from the ant's eye view. The biggest problem that we're having is even the government doesn't know how many compliances it has, and it doesn't agree with the definition of compliances. And so I think that if we want to improve productivity and do mass prosperity, we will have to get rid of this regulatory cholesterol, which is not enforced. Every time I talk about criminality, somebody in government calls me up and says, well, no CEO is in jail, why do you care? I'm like, one of my favorite lines in the Vishnu Sahasranam roughly translates to, why did God create fear? So he could take it away. So basically 26,000 criminal provisions are used for corruption. They breed informality and very low productivity, right? Lavrenti Beria, he was the head of secret police for Stalin. He always used to say, show me the person, I'll show you the crime. Don't worry about it. You just tell me whom you want to put away. And that's not very different from the 17 definitions of wages we have in labor laws, 22 definitions of workers. So in my mind, the only way forward, and we have to think of the long view, right? One of my favorite books is Jonas Salks. He was the inventor of the polio vaccine. The last line in his biography says, the only question to ask yourself is, are you being a good ancestor? Now, that's a really interesting question, right? In a world where there are no fiscal conservatives left anymore, America's fiscal deficit this year will be more than our GDP. The amount of debt they have in many rich countries has no longer become an issue because the bond vigilantes aren't there. But in my sense, I think we have a unique responsibility because of the 900 million people that Aditya mentioned who are less than 35 years old. So we've got to think about how to convert this sort of mass democracy into mass prosperity. We can't say that these are the fixed costs of democracy. So we cannot agree on how to change labor laws. We cannot agree on how to change the regulatory cholesterol. We cannot agree on how to build highways and airports unless land is done. And in my mind, actually, infrastructure, skills, and finance have shifted in the last 20 years from being a dagger in the heart to a thorn in the flesh. The only real dagger in the heart for India is the regulatory cholesterol. In sort of concluding here, in 1994, when I landed in the US for my MBA, there was a front page article on the Wall Street Journal which said that India is more interesting than important. I cut it out and kept it in my office. I hope that journalist is eating the newspaper on which he wrote that, right? Because what's happening in India is not once in a decade, it's once in a millennium. It's really once in the lifetime of a country. But we must remember the 200 million or 300 million which aren't in mass prosperity, right? I memorized Pandit Nehru's speech when I was a child, and we missed our tryst with destiny. There are 200 million people in India who will never read the newspaper that they deliver or sit in the car that they clean or send their kids to the school that they help build. So in my mind, this is not a problem like cancer or climate change. If we deregulate, if we decentralize, and we sort of deepen human capital, we have a sort of new tryst with destiny. And, as far as Trump goes and tariffs goes, historian Brodel used to warn against sort of fireflies and froth. And so I think we have a real opportunity here over the next 6 months to lay the foundations for a 20, 30-year agenda where the world is going in one direction and India can finally go in the right direction. Thank you.